Among the thousands of plantation records preserved in the archives of rural Georgia, one ledger stands apart, a document so unsettling that local historians argued for decades over whether it should ever be made public. The entry, dated March 1851, describes a female slave whose appearance was considered so disturbing that overseers initially refused to work near her. Yet within 7 years, this same woman would own the entire estate, control its fortune, and bury its master under circumstances that triggered a state investigation. The official report was sealed for over a century. What happened at Wycliffe Plantation wasn't just a tale of forbidden desire or social rebellion. It was about something far more deliberate, far more chilling, and far more successful than anyone dared to admit. Before we continue with the story of the woman they called the Abominable One, if you're ready to hear what really happened behind the gates of one of Georgia's most prosperous plantations, make sure you're subscribed to Hidden Ledger. Hit that notification bell and let us know in the comments what state you're watching from. Now let me take you back to a place where appearances could doom you, but ambition could save you, no matter the cost. The events that would later consume Wycliffe Plantation began not with a mystery, but with a transaction so routine it barely warranted a line in the overseer's journal. Wycliffe Plantation stretched across 1,200 acres of prime cotton land in Hancock County, Georgia, about 15 miles southwest of Sparta. By the late 1840s, it had become one of the region's most reliably profitable estates, producing an average of 320 bales per season. The main house, a Greek Revival structure with 6 fluted columns and a wraparound veranda, stood at the end of a quarter-mile oak-lined drive that announced the Hafford family's prominence long before visitors reached the front steps. Thaddeus Hafford inherited the property in 1842 after his father's death, along with 63 enslaved people and debts that would have ruined a less determined man. He was 31, recently widowed. His wife Catherine and their infant son both lost to childbirth 2 years prior, and known for a meticulousness that bordered on obsession. Every expense, every birth, every death, every pound of cotton was recorded in leather-bound ledgers he kept himself, never delegating the task, not even to his most trusted overseer. The plantation's workforce lived in 2 rows of pine log cabins, whitewashed once a year. Each housed between 8 and 12 people, with families separated only by thin cotton curtains. The work bell rang at 4:30 each morning, 6 days a week. Sundays were reserved for rest and mandatory attendance at services led by a circuit preacher who emphasized obedience, patience, and the promise of rewards in the afterlife. Hancock County society in 1849 consisted of about 24 planter families, a merchant class clustered in Sparta, and a transient population of overseers, traders, and craftsmen who moved between properties as needed. Social hierarchies were rigid, maintained through visiting customs, marriage alliances, and public events like the annual Harvest Ball and the 4th of July barbecue on the courthouse lawn. Thaddeus attended these functions dutifully, but without enthusiasm, earning a reputation as a man more interested in profit margins than social climbing. His closest neighbor, Robert Crenshaw, owned the adjacent property to the east, 1,100 acres that consistently underperformed Wycliffe despite similar soil. Their rivalry was polite but unmistakable, expressed through competitive bids at slave auctions and pointed remarks about yield per acre at the Sparta Mercantile. Crenshaw's wife, Louisa, led the informal social hierarchy among plantation mistresses, a role requiring no small amount of coordination, given the distances between estates and the impassable roads during heavy rains. The absence of a mistress at Wycliffe was noted, though not openly discussed in Thaddeus's presence. His sister Margaret had offered several times to relocate from Savannah to serve as hostess, but he declined each time. He employed a housekeeper, a free woman of color named Della Puette, who managed the domestic staff and ensured that meals appeared on time and linens remained crisp despite the humidity that plagued the region from May through September. It was into this carefully ordered world that Sarah arrived in October 1849. The slave coffle reached Wycliffe on a Tuesday afternoon, delayed by heavy rains that had swollen the Oconee River and forced a 20-mile detour. Augustus Webb, the trader leading the group, had sent word ahead that he was bringing prime field hands, recently arrived from Virginia. Thaddeus had been in the market for more workers since losing 4 men to typhoid the previous summer, and Virginia stock generally commanded premium prices for their reputation for strength and discipline. What arrived was something else entirely. 17 people emerged from the wagons, their clothes stiff with dried mud, and their faces showing the blank exhaustion of those who had walked over 200 miles in chains. Webb conducted the inspection in the side yard, away from the main house as was customary. Thaddeus moved down the line with his ledger, noting ages, health, and any scars or deformities that might affect work. He had learned from his father never to buy on a trader's word alone. Too many men had been ruined by acquiring workers who proved sickly or rebellious after the sale. He almost passed by the woman entirely. She stood near the end of the line, head lowered, body angled away as if trying to disappear. She looked to be in her early 20s, about 5 feet 6 inches, with a sturdy frame. Her dress, like the others, was filthy from the journey. But there was something about the way she held herself, a rigid control that Thaddeus recognized as either defiance or terror. "That one's not for sale," Webb said quickly, noticing Thaddeus's attention. "She's damaged goods. Just bringing her along because the previous owner wanted her moved." "Damaged how?" Webb shifted, glancing at the other buyers. "See for yourself if you're curious, but I'm telling you now. She's been nothing but trouble since Richmond. Nobody wants to work next to her, and I can't say I blame them." Thaddeus's interest sharpened. He hadn't built Wycliffe's profitability by following conventional wisdom. "Show me." Webb gripped the woman's chin, forcing her head up. She didn't resist, but Thaddeus saw her body go rigid. When Webb pulled down the collar of her dress to expose her neck and upper chest, Thaddeus understood immediately why the trader had tried to discourage his interest. Her skin was marked by irregular patches of pale white tissue, sharply defined against her natural dark brown complexion. The patches varied in size, spreading across her neck, disappearing beneath her clothing, and reappearing on her forearms and hands. One of the other planters made a sound of disgust and turned away. "You see? Abominable. The previous owner bought her at 12. Didn't notice the condition until she was older, and it spread. He kept her in the kitchen house mostly, away from the others. They think it's catching, though I've never seen evidence of it. Still, it creates problems, fights, superstitions. I told him I'd transport her west if he paid the cost, but I'm not representing her as merchandise." "What's her name?" "Sarah. No surname that I know of. She reads some, which the previous owner said made her useful for household tasks, can do figures well enough to keep kitchen inventories." Thaddeus closed his ledger. He had read about this condition in a medical text his father kept in the library. Vitiligo, a disorder that caused the destruction of pigment in patches of skin. Not contagious, not dangerous, and no effect on a person's ability to work. Yet he understood why Webb considered her worthless as merchandise. In a society where appearance and visible markers of race determined every aspect of fate, Sarah's condition made her an anomaly that would inspire fear, disgust, and suspicion wherever she went. "How much for the 3 men in the front and the woman?" Webb's eyebrows rose. "You serious?" "I don't joke about business, Augustus. Give me a price for all 4. The transaction was completed within 20 minutes. Thaddeus paid $800 for the 3 men, prime field hands in excellent condition, and $30 for Sarah, barely more than the cost of transporting her from Virginia. Webb seemed almost grateful to be rid of her. though he warned Thaddeus again about the trouble she might cause among the other slaves that evening. As Thaddeus updated his ledgers by lamplight, he made a notation he would later have cause to remember. Acquired female, approximately 23 years, literate, marked by skin condition that renders her appearance disturbing to others, but does not impair function. Placed in kitchen house under Della's supervision. Cost $30. Expected value uncertain. What he could not have known, what no amount of careful record-keeping could have predicted, was that this $30 purchase would alter the fate of Wycliffe Plantation in ways that would eventually require state intervention to unravel. The transformation began slowly, almost imperceptibly, like rot spreading through timber. Sarah's first weeks at Wycliffe passed without incident, though not without notice. Della Puit, the free housekeeper who had managed domestic operations for nearly a decade, assigned Sarah to tasks that kept her away from the main house, and more importantly, away from Thaddeus's direct line of sight. She worked in the kitchen house, a separate structure 20 yards behind the main residence, where meals were prepared by a staff of 4 women who had developed an efficient system that required little supervision. The other kitchen workers initially refused to share sleeping quarters with her. Della solved the problem by converting a small storage room attached to the kitchen house into private quarters, 8 by 10 feet, barely large enough for a straw mattress and a wooden crate for personal belongings. Sarah accepted the arrangement without comment, just as she accepted the sideways glances and the way conversation stopped when she entered a room. But Della, whose position required her to notice details others missed, observed something that troubled her. Sarah was far more educated than Webb's brief description had suggested. She didn't just read some, she read with the fluency of someone who had received systematic instruction. When Della tested her by leaving a newspaper on the kitchen work table, Sarah had it memorized by evening, able to recite commodity prices and political news with perfect accuracy. Her arithmetic was even more impressive. She could calculate conversions, estimate quantities, and maintain inventory records faster than Della could verify them. "Where'd you learn all that?" Della asked one evening, after discovering that Sarah had reorganized the entire spice cupboard using a logical system that actually improved efficiency. "Previous household," Sarah replied, her voice quiet and carefully neutral. "The mistress there taught her daughters. I was allowed to listen." "Allowed, or you just listened?" Sarah's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, a suggestion of intelligence deliberately kept hidden. "Does it matter now?" Della decided it didn't, but she also decided to mention Sarah's abilities to Thaddeus during their weekly review of household accounts. His response surprised her. "Have her start maintaining the kitchen ledgers," he said. "If she's accurate with figures, she might as well make herself useful. The current system is adequate, but there's always room for improvement." This decision, seemingly minor, marked the first step in a progression that would later seem inevitable to some and incomprehensible to others. By December, Sarah was managing not just kitchen inventories but also records for the smokehouse, dairy, vegetable gardens, and hen house. Her ledgers were meticulous, organized with a precision that exceeded even Thaddeus's own standards. When the annual audit of household expenses revealed that food costs had decreased by nearly 12% without any reduction in quality or quantity, Della reported the achievement to Thaddeus with barely concealed amazement. He requested to see the ledgers personally. Sarah delivered them to his study on a gray January afternoon when rain hammered the windows and made the whole house feel closed off from the world. She entered with her eyes lowered, placed the books on his desk with hands that showed the white patches extending across her knuckles and fingers, and turned to leave without speaking. "Wait," Thaddeus said, not looking up from the first ledger. "Explain this entry from November 3rd. The calculation doesn't match the previous system." She turned back, still not meeting his eyes. "I changed the method for recording partial units. The old system rounded everything to whole numbers, which created cumulative errors. This way is more accurate over time. Show me. What followed was a 15-minute discussion of accounting methodology that revealed several things to Thaddeus. Sarah's education far exceeded anything he had been led to believe. Her mathematical reasoning was sophisticated enough to identify inefficiencies in systems that had been in place for years. And perhaps most significantly, she could explain complex concepts with a clarity that suggested she had spent time thinking about precisely how to make her knowledge valuable to someone who might otherwise see her as merely another piece of property. When she finished, Thaddeus leaned back and studied her properly for the first time since her arrival. The lamplight threw shadows across her face, making the contrast between the patches of pale and dark skin even more pronounced. In that moment he understood with perfect clarity why others found her appearance disturbing. It violated an unconscious expectation of human uniformity, creating a visual dissonance the mind struggled to resolve. But he also saw something else: intelligence deliberately restrained, ambition carefully hidden beneath layers of learned deference, and a will that had somehow survived circumstances that would have broken most people. "Can you read and write as well as you calculate?" he asked. "Yes, sir. How well?" For the first time she met his eyes directly, and he saw in them a flash of something that might have been defiance or desperation, or perhaps both. Well enough to write letters that wouldn't embarrass the person signing them. A long silence followed, broken only by the rain and the distant sound of someone chopping wood behind the kitchen house. "Starting next week," Thaddeus said slowly, "you'll spend your mornings in the kitchen as usual. Your afternoons will be spent here, assisting me with correspondence and record-keeping. Della will adjust your other duties accordingly. You'll continue sleeping in your current quarters. Is this arrangement clear?" "Yes, sir." "Then you're dismissed." She left without another word. But Thaddeus sat at his desk for a long time after she was gone, staring at the ledgers and wondering if he had just made a brilliant efficiency decision or a catastrophic error in judgment. In the world he inhabited, the line between the two was often thinner than most people like to admit. News of the arrangement spread through the plantation within days, as news always did in a community where privacy was a luxury reserved for the master's family. The reactions varied by proximity and perspective. The kitchen staff whispered among themselves, but kept their opinions guarded, knowing Della would report any hint of insubordination. The field workers, whose contact with the main house was limited to brief encounters during meal distributions, mostly didn't care. One house slave's duties were much like another's as far as they were concerned. But Robert Crenshaw, who heard about it from his overseer, who had heard it from Wycliffe's overseer during a chance meeting in Sparta, raised the issue with Thaddeus over whiskey at the Sparta Tavern on a cold February evening. "You're inviting talk," Crenshaw said carefully, swirling his glass. "Having that particular girl working in your private study, people notice things like that." "People can notice whatever they like," Thaddeus replied, his tone suggesting the conversation was already over. "She's more competent at record-keeping than any clerk I could hire, costs me nothing beyond her normal upkeep, and doesn't gossip about my business in town. I fail to see the problem. The problem is appearances, Thaddeus. You're a widower living alone except for servants. She's—" Crenshaw gestured vaguely, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. "You know what she is. I know she saves me approximately 15 hours per week of administrative work that I can now dedicate to more profitable activities. If you are concerned about impropriety, Robert, perhaps you should examine why you're imagining it in the first place." The barb landed. Crenshaw's face reddened, and he changed the subject to cotton prices in the upcoming planting season. But the conversation marked a shift in how others viewed Thaddeus's household arrangements, a shift from curiosity to suspicion, from gossip to judgment. What no one outside Wycliffe could see, was the actual nature of the relationship developing between Thaddeus and Sarah during those afternoon work sessions. It was not romantic, at least not initially. It was something more complex and perhaps more dangerous, a meeting of minds that discovered mutual recognition in an environment where such recognition violated every social rule governing their respective existences. They discussed plantation business, certainly, crop yields, market conditions, inventory management, staffing decisions. But they also discussed books. Having discovered that Sarah had somehow gained access to a far wider range of literature than should have been possible for someone in her circumstances, she had read Shakespeare, Milton, and Plutarch. She had opinions on constitutional law and agricultural economics. She could debate philosophy with a sophistication that suggested years of dedicated study. Thaddeus never asked directly how she had acquired this education, sensing that the answer might implicate people who had taken risks to provide it. Sarah never volunteered the information, maintaining always the careful boundary between what could be acknowledged and what must remain unspoken. By April, she was composing his business correspondence, managing his personal accounts, and organizing his library using a cataloging system of her own design that proved more efficient than the haphazard arrangement he had inherited from his father. The afternoons in the study stretched longer, sometimes extending past dinner, requiring Della to bring meals on trays that Sarah and Thaddeus ate while continuing their discussions of crop rotation patterns or the implications of new tariff legislation. It was during one of these extended sessions on an unseasonably warm evening in late May that the dynamic between them crossed a threshold neither had consciously intended to approach. Thaddeus had been reviewing a letter from his sister Margaret, who had written yet again to inquire whether he intended to remarry and whether she might suggest some suitable candidates from Savannah society. He made a sound of frustration and tossed the letter aside. "Problem?" Sarah asked, not looking up from the ledger she was updating. "My sister believes my life is incomplete without a wife to manage my household and provide heirs to inherit this property. And what do you believe?" The question was bold, crossing the invisible line that usually prevented servants from inquiring about their master's personal thoughts. Thaddeus should have reprimanded her for the presumption. Instead, he found himself answering honestly. "I believe marriage in our society is a commercial transaction dressed up with religious ceremony and social obligation. My first marriage was arranged by my father to consolidate land holdings and political alliances. Catherine was a kind woman who deserved better than what she received from that arrangement. I have no interest in repeating the experience." Sarah's hands stilled on the ledger. "But you'll need heirs eventually. Someone to pass Wycliffe to, perhaps. Or perhaps I'll follow my father's example and work myself to death, leaving everything to a son who never wanted it in the first place." He paused, then added more quietly, "Do you ever think about what you would do if circumstances were different, if you had choices?" She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw in her expression something raw and honest that she usually kept carefully hidden. "Every single day. But thinking about impossible things doesn't change reality, Mr. Hafford. It just makes the actual circumstances harder to bear." "What if circumstances could change?" he asked, the words escaping before he fully considered their implications. "What if they weren't as fixed as everyone assumes?" The silence that followed felt weighted, dangerous. Sarah's eyes searched his face, trying to determine whether this was a hypothetical philosophical discussion or something more concrete and treacherous. Then someone would have to be willing to violate every rule that makes their society function, she said finally. They would have to be prepared to lose everything they've built, every relationship they value, every assumption about who they are and what their life means. Most people aren't capable of that kind of courage or that kind of selfishness. I'm not sure which it would actually be. Thaddeus didn't respond immediately. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the plantation grounds where the last light was fading from the sky. Somewhere in the distance, someone was singing one of the work songs that drifted up from the quarters in the evening, full of coded meanings and careful hope. What if someone was prepared for those consequences? He asked quietly, still looking out the window. What if they decided that the rules everyone else follows are built on foundations too rotten to sustain, and that the only honest choice is to stop pretending otherwise? Sarah rose from her chair, the ledger forgotten. She walked to where he stood, stopping just outside the range where their proximity would become something that couldn't be explained as merely professional. When she spoke, her voice was steady but carried an undertone of warning. Then that person would need to understand that they're not just risking their own destruction, they're risking the destruction of everyone around them. And they'd need to be very, very certain that what they're reaching for is worth that cost. He turned to face her, and in the failing light, the patches on her skin seemed less like marks of disfigurement and more like a map of territory no one else had thought to explore. "What if it is?" he asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she picked up the ledger, restored it to its proper place on the shelf, and left the study without another word. But they both knew that something fundamental had shifted, that a possibility had been named that could never be completely unspoken again. The consequences of that conversation would take months to fully materialize, unfolding with the slow inevitability of summer heat building toward a storm that everyone can sense coming, but no one quite knows how to prevent. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories that uncover the hidden truths of history, subscribe to Hidden Ledger, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. Leave your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next video.